Ding, 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 ding. It's time for more politics. Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast with your host, Paul Rader. Today is part 2 of our election 2024 preview. It's going to be a general overview of the competitive non-presidential races. So last week we talked a bit more, we talked about the more predictable races in the 2024 election. So now we're going to move on to where the highest levels of competition are, and even a little bit about contests that are expected to go Democrat or Republican, but have an outside chance of being an upset. But what exactly makes these races competitive? Why these races and not other ones? Now, it became clear when I was putting these notes together for these episodes that this was going to be way too long and way too much info to pack into one episode, so I'm going to break it up into several. Today is a more general overview of the competitive non-presidential races. I'm going to go over some of the factors that make each election more competitive versus less competitive, or at least can make them more competitive, though these contests don't need to be competitive in every single one of these aspects. And in fact, a lot of times they won't. And then I'll highlight what is expected to be competitive, which races across U.S. Senate, U.S. House, governor, and state legislative chamber control, which of those are expected to be competitive. But in another episode or two later this week, I'll dive more into what makes those races so competitive. And of course, in the week before the election, we'll cover the competitive states for the presidential races. Save the marquee of all marquee races for last, but there are plenty of races that we should pay attention to because they're all important. So, what makes a race competitive? So there's these factors that can level a playing field if a candidate or a party knows how to harness and utilize them. Big if. So, voter registration numbers, not every state tracks the party affiliation of its voters, but somewhere 30 or so states do track that. So it makes it a little bit easier to look at the populations and see, okay, who's predisposed to voting Democrat, who's predisposed to voting Republican, how many nonpartisan third-party voters are there. If there's comparable numbers of registered Democrats and Republicans, that can make things more even, but you still have to account for turnout rates. Even if there's, say, 1 million Democrats and 1 million Republicans, but Republicans turn out more often, Republicans are going to have an advantage. And in fact, use my state as an example of this. Even when Florida Democrats were more numerous than Republicans for the past 25 years, at least Democrats have really struggled to turn out their voters while Republicans have been a lot better. And now in 2021, Republican voters, for the first time in Florida's history, outnumbered Democrats. And now there's about 1 million more Republicans registered to vote in Florida than there are Democrats. So Democrats have their work cut out for them. They really need to improve their turnout capabilities for voting. Campaign spending, relatively equal amounts of contributions and expenditures, usually expected to be competitive, but if you don't spend it wisely, even a major monetary advantage doesn't matter. We can look back at the 2016 presidential election. Hillary Clinton, the Democrat, had way more money raised and spent than Donald Trump did, and she still lost the election. Open secrets numbers, the campaign committees for Clinton the committee for Hillary Clinton spent about $564 million. Donald Trump's spent only about $333 million. And then with outside money, those independent expenditures, which we'll get into in just a moment, Clinton's ones supporting Clinton spent about $206 million, and the ones for Trump spent $100 million. So even though there was a several $100 million difference in support and campaign spending for Hillary Clinton's campaign, or at least super PACs that were in support of Hillary Clinton versus the ones that supported Donald Trump or were his committee, even though there was a several $100 million difference, Donald Trump won. Didn't win the popular vote, but he won the Electoral College. So you have to know where to spend that money, when to spend that money, how to spend that money. Campaign committee expenditures versus independent expenditures. Independent expenditures are those super PACs that can raise and spend unlimited amounts of money, as long, this is a really big key here, as long as they do not coordinate with the campaigns for that candidate. So for Kamala Harris and Donald Trump, any super PACs that are supporting them, the ones supporting Kamala Harris cannot coordinate with Kamala Harris's campaign. The ones supporting Donald Trump cannot coordinate with Donald Trump's campaign. As long as they do that, they can raise and spend as much money as they please. Thanks to the Citizens United ruling from 2010, which basically ruled that limits on those organizations would be considered basically a First Amendment or an infringement on the First Amendment free speech rights that they have. But again, if you are the actual candidates' campaigns, you are subject to a lot of limits on what you can raise and spend. High levels of independent expenditures getting involved tends to indicate that there's an expectation of competitiveness. There's big money, often what they call dark money interests, especially want to leave things to chance as little as they possibly can. So they will spend as much money as they possibly can, raise as much money as they possibly can to try to make sure that their candidate wins. And so there's high spending by both the Republican and a Democrat, or if there happens to be an independent that's making a lot of noise and is keeping things competitive, there's a good chance that the race is going to be likely competitive. But there's actually one U.S. Senate race, Arizona, where there's a very stark difference where the Democrat has a huge advantage in money raised and spent, but that race is still expected to be competitive. So it's still about whether you spend that money wisely. Open seats versus incumbents. So when a seat is open, that tends to automatically add a level of competitiveness to the election as opposed to if there was an incumbent. Doesn't mean that it will be a competitive race. The Republican or the Democrat might still be a heavy favorite to take the seat, but incumbents have that major incumbency advantage from name recognition, connections, money. We've talked before in a previous episode about high rates of reelection for these incumbents, around 75 to 90% of candidates that are running for reelection, depending on what kind of race we're talking about. And again, incumbents running for reelection means they're running for that seat that they're already in. So we're not talking about incumbents who are running for a higher office like a U.S. House rep that decides to run for U.S. Senate. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about they're running for their seat or their office again. So if an incumbent is involved, depending on who the incumbent is, but if it's an incumbent involved, that tends to make things a little less competitive, just regarding other factors that might be involved. Support from the political party apparatus. So if a party thinks one of its candidates can win, it generally tries to provide support in some way, whether they're already in office or whether they are challenging an incumbent or if they're running for an open seat, like we were just talking about. If the party provides little to no support to a candidate, there is a very likely chance that that candidate has no chance of winning, or at least they just don't expect that candidate to win. Now, if the party thought the candidate had a chance, they'd probably provide some volunteers, paid campaigners, monetary support, etc. Again, those things are finite, so parties have to pick and choose which of these candidates to give these kinds of resources to. Now, exceptions could be if the party just doesn't have enough resources to spare, but they still believe the candidate can win, but you have to have the resources available, or the candidate is very wealthy and can largely self-fund their campaign. If they can do that, parties are going to try not to give too much of their resources to help them win because they're trying to help all these other candidates all across the ballot, federal, state, and local level, trying to get them to win. So you got to be able to spend or spread those resources wisely across these races all across the ballot. Now, a party providing money and volunteers and paid campaigners, that doesn't necessarily mean it is a competitive election. They could assume that their candidate has a better chance of winning than they do in reality. And again, these resources could be spent in a very inefficient manner. They're not sending their campaigners and volunteers to places where they really need to drum up support, for example, or they spend money on poor advertising, whether the ads themselves are poor or whether they should go For example, if they're spending too much on TV and they need to spend more on mailers, for example, or they spend a whole bunch of money on billboards, you have to be able to spend that money wisely. And so even if the parties fork over money for those endeavors, doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be a competitive election. They might think an election is more competitive than it actually is. But generally speaking, if a party is providing support to a candidate, they expect that that candidate has some sort of chance at winning that election. Alignment with the overall political party and highest ranking members of the party. You have to really strike a careful balance between strongly aligning yourself with your overall party and its standard bearers and distancing yourself just enough to say that you stand on your own. Now, how much a candidate should go one way or the other depends on the race. It's all a part of campaign strategy. So for candidate in, I don't know, Tennessee, running for the U.S. House in Tennessee, a Republican may want to highlight just how much they support Donald Trump there. But if you're a Republican in California in a U.S. House race, that might not be the way to go. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris, for their respective parties, can be seen as a boon or an anchor for those candidates' chances. So you really have to be able to strike that careful balance between allying yourself too much with those people, not just the presidential candidates. For Democrats, how much you ally yourself with Nancy Pelosi, former Speaker of the House, or Chuck Schumer, the Senate Majority Leader, as a Republican, how much you ally yourself with somebody like Mitch McConnell, who is the minority and previous majority leader for the U.S. Senate for Republicans, or Mike Johnson as Speaker of the House. So how much you say, oh, I'm with them versus you might also, you got to also be careful not to distance yourself too much, because then you might piss off a bunch of your core base where they're like, why are you not tying yourself to these standard bearers for our party? So a fine line that you got to walk there. Name recognition. So incumbents, like we said before, they generally inherently get a boost in name recognition, but a well-known challenger can even this aspect out. Now, challengers don't necessarily need to have a comparable name recognition, because name recognition, knowing the name of somebody, isn't the only part of the name recognition aspect. Do people have favorable views when they do know who this candidate is? Or how many of them are unsure of their opinion versus flat out, I don't like this person? There's a lot that goes into that. Just people knowing who you are isn't the end all be all, but it certainly helps, as long as there's a chance for a lot of them to, if they don't have a favorable view of you already, for them to develop a favorable view of you at some point during the campaign. Concurrent races. So concurrent meaning races that are happening at the same time, because it's not just a presidency that's going on. There's U.S. Senate, U.S. House, governor, state legislative races, local races, other races, and ballot measures too. Any one of those that are also on the ballot that are considered pivotal can lead to impacts on other races happening at the same time. So this year we've got a presidential race on the ballot. Donald Trump and Kamala Harris will be seen as either a boon or an anchor to the chances of their fellow Republicans and Democrats, respectively, like we were just saying a moment ago. So it depends on the context of the race. But with these concurrent races going on, if there's one that's expected to be very noteworthy in some way, it's going to have an effect, even if it's not all that big, or it doesn't seem to be that big of an impact. It will still have an impact on other races. And if there's a particularly close race, like for U.S. Senate, for example, if there's a really close race for U.S. Senate, what happens at for the presidential election? Like, for example, Nevada U.S. Senate is supposed to be, even though it slightly favors Democrat Jackie Rosen, the fact that it's competitive and that it's expected to be very competitive for the electoral college votes of Nevada, or Nevada, depending on who you ask. For president, it's supposed to be very competitive, and how people vote for Donald Trump versus Kamala Harris in there might decide how people vote for Jackie Rosen. Again, just depends on the context of the race. Polling numbers. Close polling numbers often suggest that a race is competitive, and not every poll is worthwhile. Media tends to treat a poll as a poll as a poll. Not every one of them is well done, or even if it's a reputable source that's doing the poll, there might be some faults that they don't necessarily account for. Polls are a very meticulous art and science, and there are certain things that can throw them off if they aren't accounted for, like a social desirability bias, how people respond in these polls, even though their name is not being put to these poll results and what they said. You're not saying John Smith said this about Kamala Harris and this about Donald Trump. That's not, you can't look into that. But John Smith might, if he thinks that it's undesirable for him to say that he supports Kamala Harris or that he supports Donald Trump, he might go the opposite direction. There's also non-response bias. Polls are having a lot of issues with these where the way they do the sample is they randomly select from a population because you want it to be random. You don't want to pick and choose people because that's going to bias the sample. But there's a lot of people that just aren't answering polls when they're being contacted. So it's limiting the pool of potential responses. And so you're not getting what they are saying or what they think about an election and the issues that are going on. So that can also bias the sample. How polls determine what a likely voter is. There's no real objective way to say this person is a likely voter. Each pollster has their own method for determining the likelihood that they think whoever's responding to their polls, who is going to actually turn out to vote. Because lots of people will let you know their opinion about what's going on in an election, but they don't actually turn out to vote. And again, there's a little bit of that social desirability bias where there's over-reporting of how much people turn out to vote. You can have like 55% turnout. If you poll people, there might be 75% of them that say, oh yeah, I totally voted, because they don't want people to look down on them for the fact that they didn't vote, saying they didn't do their civic duty, that they were being lazy, or that if they didn't vote, then they shouldn't complain, kind of thing. So just because people tell you what they think doesn't necessarily mean they're actually going to act on that they're actually going to turn out to vote. So determining who a likely voter is, there's not a real objective way to do it, but these pollsters all have their own ways of doing it. So just because there's a response in a poll does not necessarily mean that it actually has any importance for what happens in the election, because if they don't actually vote, then for the purposes of winning an election, that voter's opinion doesn't really matter. Not obviously, it does matter in the grand scheme of things, but in terms of determining who wins that election, if they don't turn out to vote, then it doesn't really make a whole lot of sense to account for their opinion. But you don't know if they're going to go vote, so it's a little bit of finickiness when determining who is likely to vote. And sometimes pollsters develop questions in a way where they try to figure out, okay, if they answer a certain way on this question, we can expect them to be a likely voter. Again, depends on the pollster and what exactly their method is. So, however, polls are very valuable in predicting election results as long as you know what you're doing with them. Don't consider them to be the end all be all, but there's a lot of people who don't understand how they work that just say, oh, polls suck, why do we even do them still? They are valuable. You just have to know how to use them and what potential flaws might arise with these polls. And then the last aspect we'll go over is obviously the candidates themselves matter. I mean, that's kind of an obvious thing to say, but we're talking about measurable and non-measurable aspects, and subjective and objective, and what I would consider semi-objective aspects, where it's not necessarily a thing that you can quantify, that you can put a number on or or a descriptor where everybody is going to say, "Oh yeah, that's undeniable." But things like charisma, authenticity. Authentic does not mean that you think someone is a truth teller. There's a lot of people that think Kamala Harris is a liar, that think that Donald Trump is a liar. Authenticity is not referring to that. It's whether you think their personality, what the kind of personality that they show, that is who they are in real life. Do you think that they're authentic? Now, I won't go into that because people might assume that that means I'm saying, oh, that Kamala Harris or Donald Trump are saying that they're authentic. People might give people an impression that I support one of them or the other. That's not, or another candidate. That's not what I'm trying to get at. But you have to admit that both of them have charisma. They're able to inspire devotion in people and really energize people. And admitting that does not make you a supporter of either one. You can admit that both of them are charismatic, different kinds of charisma, but Harris and Trump definitely have a level of charisma that is really important to have as a candidate. Now, not being charismatic does not necessarily mean that you're not a good candidate or that you're not going to be competitive or anything like that. But charisma certainly helps to have. And it's also about the ability to connect not just with voters, but local movers and shakers. Are you able to energize not just the people who are going to come out to vote, but the people who are ultimately going to work for you or work for an organization that is working for you? You got to be able to fundraise. You got to be able to limit certain gaffes, make connections, know how and where to go to rally people. So all those, a lot of times, intangible qualities of these candidates you have to account for as well. Now, when these forecasters are using all these aspects to say that this candidate is going, or that this election is going to be competitive, all these forecasters have their own way of combining all these things. This is just an overall view of a lot of the aspects of elections that an election forecaster, election predictor might use to say, this is going to be a competitive election. There's no real objective formula to doing that, but there are a lot of things that you can look out for, that to look out for to say, okay, this one is going to be an intense battle for whatever office it may be. So now a quick overview of the actual races that are supposed to be competitive. So some states or districts can be competitive for one race, but not necessarily for another. For example, North Carolina's governor is expected to stay Democratic, but it's considered a toss-up for president. New Hampshire's governor's race is expected to be much more competitive than for president. So a little bit of the opposite of what North Carolina's got going on there, to some extent. So just because you see one race as competitive in a state or a district does not mean that another race in that state or covering that same district is also going to be competitive. Again, you have to consider all these other factors that are going on. But some of the competitive contests that we will cover both in this episode or briefly in this episode and in the next few episodes: U.S. Senate, U.S. House, governorships, state legislative chamber control, not specific seats for state legislatures. There's just way too many of those. There's thousands of those. But just chambers that have a chance to flip majority party control. So if a Republican chamber has a chance to flip Democrat, or a Democratic chamber has a chance to flip Republican, those are the kinds of chambers that we'll be talking about too. First up, U.S. Senate. So the overall U.S. Senate picture, we have 51 Democrats, which includes those 4 independents that either caucus with or used to be Democrats but have now become independents. Kyrsten Sinema of Arizona, Joe Manchin of West Virginia, both who are not running for re-election, used to be Democrats. They are now independents. Angus King of Maine and Bernie Sanders of Vermont are they're longtime independents that caucus with Democrats. But in the U.S. Senate, only a third of the chamber is up every 2 years. These are 6-year terms. So you have what they call class 1 Senate seats up. Then 2 years later, they do class 2. And then 2 years later, they go class 3. And then 2 years after that, it goes back to class 1. I can't remember which class it is off the top of my head this year. I want to say it's class 1. But in any case, up for election this year are 23 Democrats and 11 Republicans. And most of the seats that are expected to be competitive are held by Democrats. So there's a really good chance for Republicans to take control of the U.S. Senate this year. And for Republicans to take control, they need one seat if Donald Trump wins, because the vice president becomes the tie-breaking vote in the Senate. So whenever the U.S. Senate splits 50-50 on something, the vice president serves as the tiebreaker. If Donald Trump wins, J.D. Vance from Ohio would become that tiebreaker. Now, if Kamala Harris wins the presidency, and then Tim Walz becomes the vice president, then Republicans would need to take 2 seats to take majority control of the U.S. Senate, because then they'd have 51 seats. And the states that are expected to at least be a little bit competitive, if not very competitive, and a couple of them I'm a little skeptical of, and I'll talk about those in just a minute, but Arizona, Florida, Maryland, Michigan, Montana, Nebraska, Nevada, Ohio, Pennsylvania, Texas, and Wisconsin. I don't personally expect a competitive election in Florida, and it's one of those ones that most forecasters see as, yeah, there's a little bit of a chance, but it's probably going to stay Republican. Reason being, I talked a little bit about it earlier, and it is my state, so I have a little bit more of a ground level view of what goes on in Florida politics. Democrats in Florida have had they've had a lot of trouble with turning out their voters over the past at least 25 years. And now there's a million more registered Republicans. There's still a lot of non-party affiliated voters that could potentially vote Democrat, but Republicans have been a lot better at getting their base to turn out than Democrats have. So I'm pretty skeptical of that one. That one is incumbent Rick Scott, who was a 2-term governor of Florida, going against Debbie McCarcel-Powell, who used to be in the U.S. House. So expect that to be retained by Republican Rick Scott, but there is a little bit of a chance that maybe that's an upset, but I would not count on it. And I'm also slightly skeptical of Texas's competitiveness, not as much as for Florida. It's definitely going to be more competitive than Florida's is, but with Republican Ted Cruz, not necessarily the most popular with his own party, but until further notice, I'm a little skeptical of just how much Texas Democrats have gained ground on Republicans statewide. But we'll see how it goes. Competitive races for the U.S. House. So overall U.S. House picture right now, 220 Republicans, 212 Democrats, 3 vacancies. Unlike with the U.S. Senate, everybody in the U.S. House is up for election every 2 years. Republicans can only have a net loss of 2 seats to retain control of the chamber, because then they would have 218 being just over half of 435. So, and only about 50 to 80 seats, depending on which forecasters you use, are considering, only about 50 to 80 seats are considered to be competitive to some extent. And races all over the place that are competitive. We can't cover all of them, but some states with competitive districts that I won't be highlighting in this particular series included some in California, Colorado, Iowa, New Jersey, New York, Ohio, Oregon, Washington, and Virginia. Now, you see a couple of those states and you think, oh, well, aren't those very Democratic or aren't those very Republican? Yes, statewide candidates for Democrats might not be competitive in one of those states, or Republican candidates might not be competitive in statewide in those states, but there's specific districts where there's more of the disadvantaged party, for lack of a better term. So, for example, California and New York, very Democratic states, but there are pockets around those states where Republicans are a lot more competitive, a lot more powerful. So just keep that in mind with districts versus the overall states. But contests we will dive into later include Alaska's at-large district, Arizona's 1st and 6th, Maine's 2nd, Michigan's 7th, Minnesota's 2nd, Montana's 1st, Nebraska's second, North Carolina's first, and then Pennsylvania's seventh and eighth. And I'll talk obviously a little bit more about what makes those competitive and why I highlight those ones specifically, besides the fact that we just don't have time to cover all of those. So competitive races for governor. Overall gubernatorial picture, the fancy way to say governor, gubernatorial. 27 Republicans and 23 Democrats right now. Like with state legislatures in 2010, Republicans made a lot of gains in governorships, and they've still held on to majority for that time. But how many they've had has ebbed and flowed. But this year, it's only 8 Republicans and 3 Democrats that are up for election. Most governorships are up in midterm elections, so 2022, 2026, 2030, so on and so forth. Now, there's too few competitive races in 2024 for Democrats to take a majority of governorships, but they can make enough of a game to where they potentially claim a majority in 2026. Or there's even a slight chance they do so even in 2025, because Virginia's governor happens in odd-numbered years, 2025, 2029, 2033, so on. Glenn Youngkin is the Republican, but in Virginia, governors can only serve one term, then they have to sit out a term, then they can run again if they want, but they can only serve one term. They can't even serve 2 consecutive terms. They have to serve one and then sit out. So there's never an incumbency advantage, really, for that election, unless you consider incumbency advantage for a party instead of a specific person. So, but for Democrats to take a majority of governorships, they're probably going to have to wait till 2026. New Hampshire's this year, New Hampshire's is easily the most competitive. Republican Chris Sununu won 4 straight elections, and in New Hampshire and Vermont actually have 2-year terms for their governor, whereas everywhere else is 4-year terms. But he's not running for re-election again. So despite, and he won 4 straight elections, 2016, 2018, 2020, and 2022. 3 of those years, Democrats actually won the U.S. Senate race. And those are governor and U.S. Senate. Those are both statewide races because everybody in the state is voting on that office. So that makes his wins a bit more stark, I guess. But before Sununu won in 2016, Democrats had won New Hampshire's governorship 6 straight times, 2004 to 2014. And then they won it 9 of the last 10 times, 2002 being the exception there. Historically, Republicans have won the governorship there a lot. But in recent memory before Sununu, Democrats were winning the governorship of New Hampshire the vast majority of the time. But election forecasters see an outside chance for Republicans in North Carolina and Washington and Democrats in Indiana, in part because the incumbents in those races are not running for re-election, whether that's by choice or because they are term limited. And Democrats have won Washington's governorship since the 1984 election, so they've done it for almost 40 years straight now. If they win it again this year, it will be 40 years straight. So North Carolina, Washington, Indiana, a little bit of competitiveness there, but probably not going to flip parties in North Carolina and Washington's case. Republicans probably not going to win. Indiana's case, Democrats probably not going to win, but you might want to pay attention, though, just in case there's a big upset in those elections. The last group we're going to talk about, state legislative chambers. So, again, the overall chambers, not specific seats, because there's just way too many of those. The overall state legislative chambers picture, there's 99 total state legislative chambers, not 100 because Nebraska decided in the 1930s to become unicameral, so they only have a state Senate. 85 chambers across 44 states are having elections this year. And there's a few cases where only one chamber of a state's legislature is having elections, but not the other chamber. For example, Michigan Senate is not having elections, but the Michigan House is. And there's some cases where only half a chamber's seat is up for election, typically Senate's. Now, since 2010, Republicans have controlled a majority of state legislative chambers. The number they've had has ebbed and flowed over time, but since 2010, they've had a majority of those chambers. Right now, Republicans control 56 chambers and Democrats control 40. In Alaska's case, they're technically Republican majorities, but they have cross-party coalitions. And in the House, there's a few independents that are part of that coalition. There's no independents in the Alaska Senate, but Republicans and Democrats, a lot of the Republicans and then all the Democrats are part of a governing coalition there. Alaska's got some very quirky politics compared to the rest of the nation. And then Nebraska's state Senate, not only is Nebraska's state legislature unicameral, where it only has one chamber, in this case, the Senate, but they are also considered nonpartisan, although in reality, most of them are Republican. But nominally, they are nonpartisan. So looking at the potential for partisan control flips for overall chambers, not specific seats that are battlegrounds, there's plenty of chambers where majority party control isn't up for grabs. They have specific seats that are competitive. So we're not talking about those here. We're talking about chambers that could potentially flip majority. So chambers with reasonable potential to flip majority partisan control. Alaska, we just talked about with the House and Senate. Now, maybe they'll keep those power sharing agreements that they have between Republicans and Democrats, and in the case of the state House there, independents. We'll have to see if Republicans increase their numerical majority and if they decide to keep those governing coalitions. So Alaska is kind of up in the air in terms of majority control because of those coalition agreements. Arizona's House and Senate is razor thin Republican majorities in both of those. Democrats have made gains in Arizona politics in recent years. Will they be able to finally flip both of those, both the state's House and state Senate chambers there? We'll talk more about that, obviously, later on this week. Michigan's House, which we just mentioned before, Senate's not having elections this year, but Michigan's House potentially could flip back. It just became majority Democrat back in the 2022 elections, so it could potentially flip right back. New Hampshire's House and Senate, Pennsylvania's House and Senate, and Wisconsin's Senate. All those are ones that could potentially flip majority party control. So we're going to talk, obviously, a little bit more about those later this week. And because this is sort of a multi-parter of this part 2 is going to technically be more than a single part. I'm actually going to do a random question at the end of this string of episodes focusing on the non-presidential races. So no random questions today. I know you're all very disappointed. So I love doing random questions, but we'll do one of those after the next, either at the end of the next episode or episode after that. Depends on how long the analysis of these non-presidential races is. Again, we only have so much time, but I'll try to pack as much useful information on all of those as I can. So we'll close it out here. Thank you again, as always, for listening to my ramblings. Find me on Facebook. More of the links in the show notes, but Facebook, LinkedIn, Medium. If you want me on your own podcast, Matchmaker FM. My book on Amazon, Why Independents Rarely Win Elections and How They Could Become More Competitive. My website, paulrader.org. That's RADER. And with that, we're going to close out. So until next time, take care.